Now, what I've done is taken all of our renders and also rendered out just the color version of our material at the same perspective and camera position. And I've created a bunch of layers in a Photoshop file so that we can compare and pick out which of these fractals we'd like to use and also the altitudes for our distribution, although we don't have to use any of these. Since we already have them in the scene, like I was saying before, it's a lot easier to use some of the setups we already have, and we can apply them to the scene. So I have each of the fractals rendered out, the altitude, and this is just the overall altitude of our terrain. And for the most part, we wouldn't really need the fractal for this since we can use the environment tab to work with altitude. But this is our amp mix fractal, and you can't see the entire layout right now, so I'm just focusing more on the bottom part. And we can see the value noise, which has a good distribution throughout the entire terrain. Our terrain noise, which is a lot more mixing back and forth between the black and the white, which will give us a really good distribution. I've also modified these slightly within Photoshop, just bringing out the contrast a little bit better. Keep in mind too that we don't have to have these sort of fall-offs around the edges of any of these fractals. And one thing you can do is if you go to, and this is with Photoshop, and it's going to act the same way as one of the filters in View. If you have Photoshop for pre-planning or you're using the open source program GIMP, this sort of a filter is available, and what I'm going to use is the threshold filter. And what this will allow me to do is really pick out the high and low points. So if we wanted to break down the value noise a little more, we could move through the threshold and see where the population would show up without, of course, that fall off. We could also do that with the terrain noise. If we wanted to bring that down a little more, and since we have the data already in these images, using this threshold filter is a good way to plan out the distribution ahead of time outside of View, because rendering it out once again would not be quite as efficient as this is. Also keep in mind that you can use any of these fractals to subtract from the other fractals, and using an image-based program makes it a lot easier for you to do that as well. You can use some of the blending modes in order to subtract the high and low values and really kind of set up your function ahead of time before you get into View, and it can be a lot easier. Depending on your knowledge level of Photoshop and image editing programs will of course impact the amount of pre-planning you can do. And what I've ultimately decided is that I really like this terrain noise for one of our distributions. It's got some nice little patches here and there where we could have forest areas and a good separation between the clumps. And we could either use part of it or in its entirety. But another thing I like is if we take a look at the material layers we have, which are based on the altitude and slope, the orange material that is showing up is another really nice distribution that I like. Now, if we want to kind of plan ahead of time what it's going to look like, what we can do is just create a copy of this layer, and what I'm going to do is go into the adjustments, and we could replace the color. So we could select one of these colors, go to the fuzziness value, and then change the color if we want, adjust the saturation to plan that out ahead of time. What I'm going to do is just delete this layer, and I'm going to use a different method, which is the magic wand tool. We're going to set the tolerance to a rather high amount making sure we're not getting into the green area. I'm also going to turn off the continuous option just so we can select our color and it'll select it everywhere and not just what's connected to it. Now we can see our tolerance level isn't high enough, so I'm going to set that up to 100. And now that might be a little bit too high. I'm just going to zoom in, and it looks like that might be alright. From far away it looks like it's picking up a little bit too much, but in actuality it's not. So now what I can do is Control Copy, just Control C to make a copy, create a new layer, or we could paste what we've already copied, or we don't even have to use the copy, and I'm going to go to the Paint Bucket tool, set our color to white, and making sure I'm turning off continuous again, and this time the tolerance really doesn't matter, and now we can click in the selected area for our new layer. Hit M on the keyboard and I can click anywhere to deselect. It goes to the marquee tool and deselects, just a really quick deselect. We can take a look just at this by itself. I have a white fill layer. I'm going to create a copy to make a black fill layer. And now we can see that distribution. And then if we want, we could also paste in the orange color that we have and see if it's oversampling at all. And it does look like we have maybe a little bit too much green showing up. So since we decided to use the terrain noise, we can see that. And we could either blend these distributions together, but right now what we can see is we have with the material separated and also the terrain noise, this would be our distribution if we were using those two. What we could also do is just use the environment options from that material and then use our fractal, which would subtract the amount. So what I can do is make a copy of the terrain noise, and I'm going to invert it. And then we can go through our blending styles. And basically we'd have to ignore the lighter areas showing up. So maybe a better method would be to, let's go ahead and make another copy of that terrain noise. And what I'm going to do is set the threshold. And now what I can do is invert this, select our white areas with the magic wand tool, delete that, turn on our white layer that we have from the material, and we could either put it underneath and you can start to see it removing the areas, or we could set up a different blending mode. But you can see it subtracting from the material with our distribution. So then we could take our rendered layer, kind of turn down the opacity amount, and take a look at where our ecosystem would show up. So just by using those two options, the settings we have for the material and the noise together, we can end up with this sort of a distribution, where the white patches on our terrain are where the ecosystem would show up. Now that might not be enough, and you might want to subtract from that, blend with it. Really, it depends on what you want to do with the scene. I just wanted to show you a couple of different ways to kind of plan this out ahead of time so that you don't get frustrated a little bit down the line when you have to sit there and tweak all of your settings to get them to work. So we can always fall back on this option and these different settings and this file itself to figure out where we want our distribution. Now what we can also do is set up our custom distributions. In other words, new fractals we're going to be using along with what we currently have in the scene. Just because it's not in the scene yet doesn't mean we don't want to create anything new for it to mix and blend together. So now we're going to go back into View and modify our terrain a little in order to make it render faster. And basically that's just going to involve converting it to a standard, and we're going to lose a lot of detail, but it's just going to be a quick way for us to set up and create new distributions for our ecosystem and new fractal settings that we'd like to use, and then we could load them back into the layers if we want to in order to compare and get ready to set up our ecosystem.